Right, and I would say from the neurobiological perspective, we try to figure out correlates or substrates
Mm-hmm.
that can help identify your sort of attachment to self
Yes.
and the liberation of that attachment. And I think probably the best examples today, you brought up pain. I think that's where some of the best evidence is to
Yep.
suggest a distinction between self and other is very clear, where you see someone else experiencing pain and particular neural substrates are active during the time of observing somebody,
Mm-hmm.
right? But if you were to experience the pain yourself, how similar would those neural substrates be?
Right.
It turns out the level of similarity of activation between experiencing pain yourself and watching others experience pain
Mm-hmm.
depends on how close you are, how close you feel that you are related to that other person.
Yes.
So if it's the Queen of England, okay, those neural networks look very different.
Yeah.
If it's your significant other in your life, or mother, if you have a good relationship with your mother, then those differences are less, right?
Yes.
And this is one of the best examples, I think, that could even be a metric for your progress as a practitioner.
Mm-hmm.
Because no matter whether it's the Queen of England or your significant other,
Yes.
there should be less and less of a difference if you are significantly progressing along the path.
Yes, of course. And then that's that other centeredness we talked about as the guidepost for not self.
Right. So your brain would make no distinction there.
Exactly.
Right. And
Exactly.
that's critical because you make a distinction. That's not me.
Yeah.
That's someone else. Someone else is getting hurt in Syria, not me.
Yes.
Well, why is it when advanced practitioners practice compassion, why is their amygdala so highly active? That doesn't make
Yes.
sense. Their amygdala should be down, suppressing that emotional response. But it turns out that their physiology
Mm-hmm.
may be looking like somebody who's actually experiencing the suffering themselves.
Yes.
But with the equanimity that they have internally,
Mm-hmm.
they're not experiencing the maladaptive effects of that suffering.
Yes.
Now that is still something I think we're all grappling with and trying to understand. What is it like to be an advanced practitioner, to experience someone else's suffering?
Mm-hmm.
And is it harming us in some way? I mean, some people talk about compassion fatigue, for example.
Mm.
And if someone is a very compassionate human being and they're dealing with suffering all the time, where does that energy go? How do you dissolve that energy if you are experiencing it like it is your own? And if there is that non-duality present, and you are really present with everyone else's suffering, are you able to, through equanimity, dissolve that energy?
Yes.
And ground it in a way that rids it and transforms it into something more positive?
Yes.
Now that's a very tall order. And I think,
Yes, it is.
and to be honest, my own opinion, and I've always felt this, is that it's kind of dangerous to assume that anybody can do some of these advanced compassion-based practices, because
Mm-hmm.
if you're taking on someone else's suffering, how do you transform that? It's not an easy thing to do. We may have mentioned this before, but the Ketero in the native Andean mountains, the natives to the Andes, they they have their own very well articulated practice of transforming negative energy. They call it heavy energy, hucha. It's heavy energy. It's just negative energy. If someone is negative, you feel it, right? And so they have a way of grounding it through their navel to the earth. They put it through the Pachamama. Pachamama takes all that energy and takes it away. But there's not a lot of those techniques that I'm aware of for Buddhism And it's only assumed that as you advance in your practice, you will be better at doing that.
Some of the 6 yogas of Naropa, some of the tantric yogic practices are geared more for that. Actually, in my book, I taught a clinical version of Tonglen, this giving and sending, which I think is a way of working it with patients so that they're not under the delusion that they're actually taking on suffering. See, this is the thing. You're always combating the mind creating delusion around anything, including the practices. Because the ego is very good at coming in and owning it. I am the one who takes on suffering.
Right.
And I would also just say that Olga Klimecki has done some beautiful work on that difference between the compassion network in the brain and the empathy network. She and Tanya Singer are pretty well convinced that it's empathy fatigue and not compassion fatigue. That compassion is a different whole other neural network that's less egoically associated with taking on suffering. So
right. Well, this is another problem in the field of how we interpret a concept like compassion, because it's always confused with things like sympathy, emotional contagion, and empathy, for example. Always confused. And I would just encourage people to look at Tanya Singer's work, and there's an ebook actually out that distinguishes very nicely about compassion, empathy, emotional contagion, sympathy, and concepts similar to that.
That's one of the reasons I spend so much time on this in my book.
Yeah.
Trying to tease this out so that the confusion would somehow not continue to be spread contagiously among psychotherapists.
But this is great that we're talking about it, because it's what's considered the glue behind this non-dual state, this enlightened state, this awakened state. Yes. You can't experience the awakened state without that compassionate, that true compassionate orientation. And this also speaks to the idea, I think that's a little bit misconstrued in the literature, about self-compassion versus just compassion. And we're always talking about, be more compassionate towards yourself. And it sort of assumes that there's a distinction between compassion towards self and compassion towards others. There's actually a scale. Kristen Neff has a scale that looks at self-compassion and other compassion. Mm-hmm. And I think that as much as I think this is a great beginning to trying to understand compassion, it's a little bit misleading, because at least from the Buddhist perspective, there is no distinction between self-compassion and other compassion. Right. Compassion is compassion. It's non-dual. It's non-referential. It's the awakened state. And you can't have that for yourself versus other. It's just it's universal.
I think this is actually a good time for me to read this paragraph from Anam Thupten, because he actually describes all of the different levels of not self that you and I just went through in the clinical discussion from the Buddhist perspective. And Wonderful. Of course, it ends up with non-referential compassion, believe it or not.
Oh, perfect.
Okay. So he says, when we pay attention to our breath, body sensations, and to the awareness that arises, then all the illusions, suffering, confusion, sorrow, and personal issues, all of this begins to dissipate. We see that all of these experiences are born of delusion. This is the sense of I. I am real. I am truly existent. Everything is gone except this I, this sense of self. Then, when we continue meditating, the sense of self also goes away. When we just keep meditating, we just remain in that awareness and observe, then the self dissolves too. When the self dissolves, there is just pure awareness. When the self completely collapses, there is this inexpressible, simple yet profound and ecstatic, compassionate awareness. Nobody is there. I is completely non-existent in that place. There is no separation between samsara and nirvana, and there is nobody pursuing the path or chasing after enlightenment. This is exactly what you've said, that the awareness itself, as its manifesting quality, is this non-referential, compassionate impulse, that it's
Right.
inherent in the awareness itself, and that is something that is other than this egoic sense of a solid separate self. And so when we say not self, we are not saying you're not going to be you anymore. You're going to be more of you.
Yeah.
Actually.
More of you. Yeah. Yeah, you do. You take the world joins with you. You get more, you're connected, you're much more connected to all beings. There's no way we can really describe this in an accurate way yet with the limited technology we have in neuroscience, but these are constructs that fit onto our map. And as we continue to draw up the blueprints of this map, we can reveal some of the layers underneath, which are the neurobiology. So what are these biological markers? This is just a beautiful way of clarifying what we mean, what the Buddhists mean within this wonderfully articulated and rigorously systematic way of describing mind.
Yeah.
The Western model of mind is pathetic compared to that. We have no clue what the hell the mind is. We point our finger a bunch of times, but we know the saying about pointing fingers at things. Doesn't really tell us much. So I think what we're learning is that the neurobiology, along with contextualization through situated and embodied perspectives, that where the philosophical point of view enters in, and a purely cognitive point of view enters in, and the clinical perspective adds to this rich description. When people are experiencing these no-self states, these temporary, non-dual experiences, and you can do this just by resting in awareness for a moment. You can just drop right in.
Yep.
Through training, eventually that's what happens, and it's this expansiveness that happens, the way it's described, and the way that many practitioners experience it. So, what's happening at that point in the brain? Well, we can certainly say something's happening, and most people will be like, "Wow, that's really cool." A lot of people would also say, "Well, what does that really tell us, and how's that going to be helpful?" So, just to appease everybody, I will say that what we think is happening is very similar to what's happening when someone's practicing, say, compassion practice. It's a state of higher cognition. It's not suddenly your brain disappears, but there is brain activity, I think, that is related very strongly to higher order cognition. So particular substrates in the brain that are responsible for making us human are actually the most active, and more active than any other time. It's the rest of the systems that keep us perceiving and evaluating that sort of drop off. But it's a very stable form of concentration. At least the networks that seem to be responsible or now sort of theorized to be responsible involve just a higher order form of cognition. And it's just a stable attention, just as you would describe it in the Buddhist text. You would describe it from the neurobiological point of view to sort of map on very clearly as just a state of awareness. And where you see many of the other substrates of processing information drop off, but without the zoning out type of experience.
Exactly. So you've just described is embodied cognition, and it's very, as you said, it is very easy. Everybody can do it right now.
Yeah.
Okay, all you have to do is just allow yourself to be aware of the surroundings that are around you. Literally,
Yeah.
let your ears open, let your eyes open, and see, hear everything around you. Feel, and when I say feel, that means feel the feeling of your body, wherever it is, if it's in the chair, if it's on your bed, wherever you are, feel the actual feeling of your body, feel the weight of it, and allow your senses to tell you the nature of the way things are.
Yeah.
This is embodied cognition. This is open awareness. This is essentially what we're describing as being more of who you are, because you're no longer fixated on some internal story that is what people mostly pay attention to in their, as you beautifully described it, their 500 millisecond increments of experience.
Yeah. I will say that through sort of some empirical support for this, we have some data. We haven't published it yet. We're waiting to look at how it compares to novices. But our expert meditators were found to be more aware of the periphery.
Yes.
Without even knowing that they're aware.
Of course.
So that's another point that a lot of people think, well, as you become more experienced practitioner, you should be aware of everything that's happening underneath awareness. The stuff in the first 250 milliseconds, you should be more aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, maybe not. I think that's still an open question. But the fact is that you're able to report things from your periphery without even knowing that you're aware of it. Like you have some insight as to what's happening out here.
Yes.
Without even knowing that you have perception into it. And just by being aware in that non-dual state, you're also freeing up cognitive resources.
Yes.
And that means that you're allowing your attentional substrates to then latch onto the things that are around you rather than focusing on what's going on inside. It's not processing information, it's open to what's outside or inside. It's taking in what's ever happening now.
Right.
Now. It's just more expanded because you've freed up all the resources necessary to be more aware. Every 500 milliseconds, I was saying, is like a moment, right? So if I showed you two objects within 300 milliseconds of each other, it's unlikely that you will even see the second object because the first object is being processed, so much so that you don't have any cognitive resources available to see the second one. Mm-hmm. Now, if you are limiting how many attentional resources you have to this particular first object, then you will have enough resources to see the second one in a shorter amount of time. Similarly, many of us go around our world like this. I see everything and are hyper-vigilant to what's directly in front of us. But it's a tunnel, okay?
Right.
And if you aren't so hyper-vigilant to what's around you, you can then be vigilant, without the hyper part, to everything around you. And I think there's a balance there. It's being able to shift to extreme concentration and focus when necessary, and using that skill when necessary, but not doing it all the time. That's where anxiety comes in. And if you're able to just let go of that sort of tunnel vision when necessary, you keep it out, and you have this sort of a more aware or expansive form of awareness.
Yes.
And then when necessary, hone in, but not all the time. Because if you're honed in all the time, you're going to be just anxious.
My way of saying that, there is full presence in the arising and passing of phenomena as they are occurring in the stream of experience. And so there's a sense of presence, of being in the experience without fixation. Patients come in and tell me how joyful it is for them to be in their lives without the fixation on everything that they're normally thinking and feeling with regard to what's occurring. Rather just having the experience and being able to act what I call dynamic responsiveness, which is a term from the Tibetan texts, that instead of having to continually think about what you're going to say and do, there's presence. So there's this dynamic responsiveness that's spontaneous and occurs along with the flow of experience. You are just another aspect of what's occurring. And because you're there, it's easy to spontaneously respond. I think that's the R in SART.
Yes, the regulating, exactly. The impulsive nature of our tendencies to want to just speak over somebody. Yeah, good listening is like a critical sort of skill. Probably another way to identify how advanced somebody is.
Well, it's hard to do if the nervous system is activated.
Right.
If you're activated in an experience, it's very difficult to just hang back and listen. So we need to be really clear that all of the mind states we're talking about have corresponding body states.
You need to have the awareness of yourself and your relation to others to be able to regulate so you can listen and be heard, and then transcend, to realize there is a relationship that you have with others that's important, that to realize the distinction is little. And that, again, we're at the level of trying to clarify constructs, because whether it's mindfulness, compassion, or enlightenment, all three are always conflated with many common interpretations. And whether it's empathy, theory of mind, sympathy, or whether it's acceptance, awareness, attention, non-judgment, or awakening.
Mm-hmm.
What are these constructs? I think we're slowly developing this science, and we're going to be better at clarifying and translating the concepts into more common, everyday psychological terms and concepts, and with an underlying neurobiological framework. And as we get closer and closer to that, we will also have a form of neurotherapeutics. Yep. Which allows one to use the neuroscience and the technology to improve one's awareness, improve one's regulation and transcendence as sort of a scaffolding. So I'm excited for that, and I think we're moving towards that.
Me too, and actually I am not opposed to neurotherapeutics as a clinician. I think that it's another tool in our toolbox that can be extremely helpful. What I hope is that, as we go forward, that somehow those of us who actually work with patients, that we're included somehow in the research and the discussion about all this, because we're the ones who get to see people's progress. We get to see what works and what doesn't work, because we're delivering and seeing people either in short-term therapy or, for the people who have serious either psychotic maladies, or they also have personality disorders. Sometimes we see those people in therapy for a couple of years. So we really get to chart progress as well as regress. And progress again and regress in terms of what liberation looks like clinically in a psychotherapeutic context.
Yeah.
So
I think that's going to be really helpful. And similarly to the whole embodied cognitive perspective too.
I don't really know whether or not neurobiology is capable of delineating the actual essence, substance, I don't know what to call it, of pure awareness. Because if it is truly beyond, I'm not sure how any machine can detect beyond. On the other hand, it is an actual experience.
It's the classic philosophical question of, if I'm able to take the pattern of neuronal activity of my experience of a sunset and replicate it into silicon chips, one neuron at a time, and put that into, some sort of AI computer, would it have the same experience of that sunset as me?
Well, of course, you and I would both agree that it might not, because it doesn't actually have a human body. Right. And even the Buddhist texts are very clear that a human body is the necessary condition for awakened embodied cognition.
And there's going to be perspectives on both sides. The hard neuroscientists would say, absolutely, of course.
I know.
That's what it is. It's right in the brain. But
know.
it's certainly a debate that's going to continue until we actually can try it.
And this is the most amazing discussion, really.
Yeah, it's been wonderful and really rich. No, I think I would just encourage people to look at your book because I think it does a great job of articulating many of these concepts that are difficult. And the literature, so the SART paper that I've written, as well as the Enlightenment paper with Jake Davis. And I also wrote a paper in New York Academy of Sciences that also clarifies a little bit about what we meant by habits of mind.
Mm-hmm.
And in the time scale, it talks about the 0 to 500 millisecond sort of time scale and what's happening. So those are good resources at least.
I'm so glad you're here on the planet doing this work, David. That's all I can say, really. Thank you so much.